I'm Dr. Sara Meunier. I'm soon to be graduated in a couple of weeks, psychiatrist, and I've been studying neuroscience and mental health for about the last decade. I do clinical work in mental health. I also do a lot of work in addictions and chronic pain. And when I've done this talk before, it's usually about an hour, so I have condensed it, and I'm going to try really hard to keep it to 10 minutes or less, fingers crossed. Thanks, Caitlin and Wayne, for asking me to do this. I'm hoping that as we talk about the endogenous opioid system, you guys will see how it relates. I guess first we should probably define what the endogenous opioid system is. So you guys have probably heard of opioids in the past. Those are things like fentanyl, heroin, hydromorphone, morphine. Those are all exogenous opioids, so external, and they act on our body's own opioid system. That's why they're so powerful and so damn addictive, is because they're actually capitalizing on an evolutionarily very, very old system that's really involved with a lot of different things, but specifically for this talk, we're going to talk about pain, reward, and social bonding. So I want to acknowledge that I am in Calgary, Alberta right now, and I'm really grateful to have spent the last 11 years here in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. I'm very thankful to the rivers and the land and the people here that have allowed me the space to grow. I don't have any financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. I'm paid by the taxpayer, so thanks, guys. My only conflict of interest really is that I'm a big, big believer in the healing power of art and of community. And one of my disclosures is that the brain is super complex. It's inherently reductionist to talk about neuroscience. In the past, I've gotten very disillusioned by how reductionist it is, and kind of my pendulum has swung the other way, and I've started to really try to visualize things in like really expansive terms. But then I also think that that in itself loses some of the truth that is within neuroscience as well. So I definitely do not believe that neuroscience explains everything about our internal and external experience, but it does have a role. So I think it is important to think about. And because it's so complex, I'm going to talk to you about the things that I've learned over the last decade and what I've learned by kind of taking a deep dive into some of the literature around the neurological basis of social bonding and the endogenous opioid system. You know, our understanding of the brain is always changing, and 5 years from now, our understanding might be completely different. So we will see. Now, 10 minutes is pretty quick. So in order to be able to do this, I'm going to have to ask you guys to just take my word on a few things, because we don't have time to go through everything. But I think there's a few assumptions that we all sort of have to be on board with to be able to understand some of these concepts. So the first one is that the brain actually operates on numerous networks. And these networks are kind of always acting together in balance, opposing one another and stimulating another. It's not nearly as simple as one neurotransmitter results in behavior. It's much more complex than that. And if you're interested in brain networks, neurosynth.org, in addition to having a cool name, is also just a fantastic website to be able to explore these things in more detail. The second assumption is that these networks, and really all of the brain, is operating on balance and rhythm. If we think about it, rhythm is actually our most primal sense. We had rhythm before we ever had a heart rate or breathing. It formed the basis of how our brain has evolved. And these networks, in particular for today's talk, the salience network, so the part of our network that governs like what is important in the environment, and the reward network are important, and they are acting in balance and rhythm all the time. The third assumption that I'm going to make is that the brain has evolved to drive adaptive behavior. There's a reason why our brain looks different than a manatee's brain and different than a cow's brain. It's because what's adaptive for us is not as adaptive for a bandicoot. I have a second disclosure here. It may be by design. I don't actually know. I talk about things from perspective of evolution because that's how I've come to understand them. Okay, so the endogenous opioid system is actually 3 overlapping systems. There's the mu opioid system, which is activated by endorphins, which people might have heard of before. There's the delta opioid system, and there's kappa. We're going to focus on the mu opioid system today, mostly because that's where most of the research has been done, and it's easiest to talk about. So, what does it do? Well, the opioid system is really involved in reward, and it turns out that our body's own opioids, they actually mediate what's called hedonic processing, and they assign the valence of reward and loss, which is essentially like how good does a reward feel and how painful is a loss. And typically when people talk about reward in the brain, they talk about dopamine. Actually turns out endogenous opioids activate the dopamine system, but it seems like dopamine is more related to the component of reward that's like wanting, like the drive or the craving for seeking a reward, whereas the opioid system is more involved in how good does it feel. Huge involvement in our stress response system. So you guys may have heard of the fight or flight system. That's the part of our body that gets activated if we see like a bear on the trail, and our heart rate goes up and our breathing gets really quick. We get really restless and hot because all the blood is going to our muscles because our body's getting ready to like fight the bear or run away. Do not fight a bear. And the way that actually works in the brain is that there's some sort of stressor, and a hormone that's called corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, gets released. It goes down to the adrenal glands, they release cortisol, and that's what actually causes the fight or flight body response. And it turns out that CRF actually, it induces a high tonic firing within the locus coeruleus to release epinephrine or adrenaline. The stress response is not always a bad thing, because that actually will help us increase our attention, increase our arousal, and increase our behavioral flexibility. So it's not always a bad thing to have a bit of a stress response, but you want it to be adaptive. And so opioids actually induce a phasic firing. So they set our brain back to its baseline firing, essentially kind of turning off the stress response and allowing us to recover. So when we get away from the bear, the opioids get released so we can help relax again. And these 2 systems, the opioid system and corticotropin releasing hormone, they're again like acting in balance all the time to ultimately result in adaptive behavior. This is also not good if our stress response system is just going. Also involved in emotions, it turns out. Opioid system is consistently associated with the approach emotions of happiness and anger, as well as the avoid emotions of sadness and fear. So opioids actually facilitate approach emotions, and they tend to inhibit the avoid emotions like sadness and fear. You know, there's a reason why people feel like heroin feels so damn good. It's because it makes you euphoric. Problem is, if you use it all the time, your body and your brain adjust, and then it causes way more problems than it solves. All right, shifting gears now into social bonding. So if we think about with humans, there is a survival advantage to being in groups. We are not designed to survive on our own. We don't have sharp claws or teeth or shells. I can't do well on the wilderness, in the wilderness on my own. And so we had to evolve something that would allow us to be able to stay in groups, because there's also a lot of things about group living that is very difficult. People piss you off. And so our brains actually had to evolve a way to give us some sort of reward for being in a group. Turns out that it co-opted a very old system, the opioid system, to be able to give us that reward. And so it seems like somewhere along evolution, this system got taken over for social mammals. And initially it was all around social grooming and social touch. right? Because those are excellent ways to be able to facilitate social bonding among mammals, which is why I use this picture. So if you look at that monkey being groomed, he looks chilled right out. And the idea is that when we have social touch, it's releasing our body's own opioids. It's giving us that reward. It's facilitating that feeling of euphoria. It's turning off our stress response system. And all of those things are going to allow us to keep participating in the bonding and the grooming in this case long enough that we can actually form a cognitive relationship, a thinking relationship that's based on mutual trust and obligation. Right, so we have to turn off our stress response so we can stand each other long enough to become friends, is essentially what it is. Now, when it evolved into more complex behaviors with humans, it turns out there's a limit on how much you can groom in one day. And that's going to put a limit on how many people can be in your group. They estimate the upper limit with social grooming as your only bonding is about 50. Right? So humans need larger groups than that. And so as behavior got more complex, as our groups needed to get bigger, our brain had to adapt ways to do what they call grooming at a distance, right? So how can we have the same effect without physically having to pick lice out of one another's hair? And then importantly, I want to talk about how do we use these concepts? I like this idea of brain hacks. How can we use what we know about the brain to make it work for us? And so really we're going to talk now about what are some behavioral targets of the endogenous opioid system. And a lot of these are going to relate back to survival advantage and this idea of grooming at a distance. So the most obvious one is social touch. This is from the old presentation. These are ways that we know it elicits the endogenous opioid system. Unfortunately, right now, in the times of COVID, social touch is quite limited, which is why we're all together now. So what are some other things? Social laughter, it turns out, is a really beautiful way to do this. Watching comedy clips with our friends versus alone. Watching comedy with other people triggers the same system. Music and dancing, it turns out, actually is a huge one. They've done some interesting studies where they looked at people singing all together as a group, dancing all together as a group, drumming all together as a group. And if you think about it, these are great ways to organize people, right? When we're participating in these things together, our brains actually start to sync up, right? We release our endogenous opioid system that gives us that reward, that turns down our stress response system. And then we can start to form relationships within a group. Some other targets, exercise, right? They talk about the endorphins being released. Food, even just looking at pictures of pleasurable food increases your own endogenous opioid. Sex is a great way. And I really think it comes down to community, right? If we think about what we're trying to do here is grooming at a distance, is bringing people together and figuring out how can we bond at a distance. So in conclusion, the opioid system helps us to modulate adaptive behavior. And I really think that we can use some of this knowledge to figure out how to hack into this system and use it to our advantage. I think it has a huge role in art, right? And community. It's not going to help, or it's not going to hurt, right? Try hugs, not drugs. And I think from that mental health perspective, I think it's critical that as a society, we start talking about social connection as health promotion. We know loneliness is toxic, increases in morbidity and mortality, and how can we, to the point where how do we even design our community spaces to be able to encourage people to connect? And how do we start thinking about ways to connect in the current era, COVID? All right. Thanks, everybody.